Cluster B personality disorders are characterized by dramatic, overly emotional, and unpredictable thoughts and behavior. From Ars Longa Media, this is Cluster B, scientifically informed, expert insights into the 4 Cluster B personality types: antisocial, borderline, narcissistic, and histrionic personality disorder. Here's today's host, Dr. Todd Grande.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, what is imposter syndrome? And some other related questions would be, is it related to any personality constructs, like something in the 5-factor model? And is it related to the dark triad? I've also heard the question, is it common in the counseling profession? So I'm going to answer these questions by looking at the 8 signs of imposter syndrome. So starting with the term imposter syndrome, this is also called imposter phenomenon. It's first important to note that it's really just a condition. It's just something that we see in clinical practice and in other places. It's not a mental disorder. You won't see imposter syndrome listed as an official mental disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, for example. Just a condition we observe. It does seem to happen. We know it's kind of a real phenomenon, but not everything like this is pathological. Not everything causes clinically significant distress. The term imposter syndrome was coined in 1978. The original idea behind the term hasn't changed very much, although it is now applied to a wider range of circumstances. We see the syndrome is when somebody has a sense that they are going to fail to live up to the expectations of other people. They are not authentically accomplished. They don't appear to be successful. They are feeling like they're a fraud. When they make mistakes or have failures, they don't view that as simply feedback on their performance. Rather, they tend to look at it as indicating something about their personality, something about their worthiness as a person. So they internalize setbacks, particularly in work settings. That's where we really see imposter syndrome being used. That term is applied often to work and specifically to certain professional environments. So when people with imposter syndrome are successful, they believe that their skills did not play a part in that. Rather, it was random error, luck, something like knowing the right people or being in the right place at the right time. So that's what imposter syndrome is. Let's take a look at the 7 signs of imposter syndrome. Number one is really about who tends to be affected. We usually think of imposter syndrome as being more common among certain groups. People who earn a lot of money, high achievers, people who had parents who are both highly successful, people who have taken over like a family business. We see this quite a bit with like a father who started a business and a son who took it over. He doesn't feel like he can live up to the father's expectations and run the business as well as the father did. We see that imposter syndrome is more common among women, minorities, and as I mentioned before, among certain types of professionals. Typically, we see it in careers or professions where the appearance of being intelligent is critical to success. So it is common among mental health professionals, including counselors, but it's also common among professors like academics, lawyers, business people, especially kind of high-ranking business people, and students. With many of the signs that I'll be using here, with many of the descriptions in these signs, I'll be using mental health counselors as an example. Sign number 2 of imposter syndrome is when people start to doubt their field is actually valid. So it's not only about self-doubt, it can be about doubting the validity of a profession. So if somebody's teaching, say, economics, that's their profession, they start to wonder if economics is really helpful to anybody. They ask questions like, have economists been able to predict or stop economic downturns? So again, really just questioning if economics is a valid field. If somebody runs a lawn care company, they might wonder if we really need to cut grass. What if we stopped cutting the grass? Would anybody care? Would people just do it themselves? And we look at it from a mental health counselor point of view. I see it expressed in a number of different ways. What would happen if people just stopped receiving counseling? Would people just get better on their own from mental illness? Can other things work just as well as counseling, like physical exercise, medication, or having supportive people around you? And I also see counselors kind of examining carefully certain diagnostic categories and wondering if those categories are valid, especially some of the more controversial diagnoses like dissociative identity disorder, DID, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. So with DID, they may say, is that just simply dissociation? Or with ADHD, they may say, is that really just normal behavior? Are we asking too much of, say, students, for example, when we want them to stay still in class? Maybe it's normal for kids to run around, right? So the focus kind of narrows, again, on the parts of the field that are more controversial. And they don't really look at the many diagnoses that are extremely well established and everybody tends to agree on. They look at the ones that are kind of up for some level of debate. Sign 3 is they tend to challenge the validity of their own skills and ability. So this is really chronic self-doubt. Am I really good at counseling? Do my clients actually improve? Do their mental health symptoms abate? Am I really helping them? What evidence supports my effectiveness? What would happen if I measured outcomes? Would clients be improving? Would those outcomes support my skills and ability? So a lot of different questions they can ask themselves. Along with this chronic self-doubt comes consequences like problems with mood. We see a lot of depression, anxiety, perfectionistic work tendencies in an attempt to overcompensate for the chronic self-doubt. This is not unlike some of the symptoms we see with obsessive compulsive personality disorder. We also see practicing skills to make sure they understand. So like over-preparing. So for example, maybe practicing CBT techniques, cognitive behavioral techniques, over and over. So they feel like they've perfected that technique and they're competent in that technique. They may take on more work to give themselves more opportunities to prove their value. But again, those opportunities may bring success, but they'll fail to recognize those successes. We see a lot of unrealistic goals being set. We also see increased levels of stress, burnout, and decreased job performance and satisfaction related to this chronic self-doubt. So one of the theories is that imposter syndrome actually leads to avoidant coping, and this leads to emotional exhaustion, and this leads to low job satisfaction. So some examples of avoidant coping would be like self-statements related to disengagement, like I've given up on trying to cope with these thoughts, like thoughts of self-doubt. We see self-statements related to self-distraction, like I've been doing something to think about this less, like going to the movies, watching TV, reading, daydreaming, sleeping, or shopping. Now, what's interesting about this self-statement is that anecdotally, like in my experience as a mental health clinician, I've noticed that maladaptive daydreaming seems to be one of these self-distraction techniques related to imposter syndrome. So maladaptive daydreaming isn't a mental disorder, it's a condition, but it's something that's not extremely well studied. So I find it interesting that it seems to line up a bit with imposter syndrome. So the fourth sign of imposter syndrome is tending to draw comparisons between yourself and other professionals. So again, kind of using the example of mental health counselors. They might look at other counselors and say, those counselors seem to be more competent than I am. Their clients are improving. That counselor always seems so confident and self-assured. Similarly, they ask themselves questions regarding their own education and training. Like, did all these other people go to a better institution than I did? Did they learn from better professors? How is it that they know what they're doing and I don't know what I'm doing? Right? So a lot of comparisons with imposter syndrome. Sign number 5 is having difficulty with both praise and criticism. So somebody who has imposter syndrome doesn't like receiving praise. It makes them uncomfortable. They don't like being called an expert. They always seem to have a comeback for when somebody says something nice about them or their performance. Like, I don't deserve credit for this. Anybody could do this job. It was nothing. I'm not the one you should be recognizing. And if they can't downplay the contribution, like if the success is really quite clear, then they'll downplay the success. So if they were like working on a proposal for a new contract, they might say, well, we won't get that contract, or it really doesn't pay that much money anyway. It's not important to the company. In terms of criticism, criticism can trigger imposter syndrome, or it can make it worse. They tend to believe criticism and expand it to all areas of their performance, skills, and abilities. So they're easily shaken, even if the source of criticism is not valid or if it's anonymous. They'll still take that as if it has a lot of strength and should be given a lot of weight. Sign number 6 is they tend to overanalyze job postings and then they don't apply for the job, right? So say that a job requires a bachelor's degree, like a Bachelor of Science or Bachelor of Arts. We know that when jobs like this are posted, a lot of people without that degree will still apply for that job. So if they've earned 60 credits or 90 credits toward a bachelor's degree, they might apply hoping they'll still be considered for an interview. But a person with imposter syndrome would only apply if they had not only the minimum qualifications, but also their degree would have to be really closely related to the job. They might also look at their experience, and the experience requirement might say you have to have 5 years in this field, and they might have 8 years and say, well, some of the years that I worked were part-time, so I really can't count those toward the 5 years. When most anyone else would just apply regardless of how they earned those years of experience. Sign number 7 is they're always predicting disaster. They believe that at any moment they're going to lose all their credibility. And this can happen when they're exposed as a charlatan, as incompetent. And of course, they believe this is the case. Or if their entire field is exposed as being fraudulent. So it's this constant risk of their life and their identity kind of falling apart, because a lot of people do strongly identify with their career, with their profession. So for the person with imposter syndrome, this is always in the balance. It's always at risk. And of course, this leads to a lot of stress. Now, sign number 8 has to do with the personality of somebody with imposter syndrome. So of course, the personality traits could be anywhere, but the tendency that we see would be high openness to experience, mid-range conscientiousness. Some of the research literature says low conscientiousness. I've seen it more expressed in people with mid-range, but again, somebody could have any level of conscientiousness. That's just really what I've seen in my experience. We see mid-range extroversion, and some would say low extroversion is more related to it. In my experience, again, more mid-range. We see high agreeableness, so somebody that tends to trust other people and tends to look at what other people say and take it very seriously. So again, really consistent with imposter syndrome. And we also see high neuroticism, so being highly reactive to stimuli in terms of emotional reactivity. So being easily depressed or having anxiety brought on easily from external events. Now, in terms of this question in the dark triad, this is also kind of related to this personality sign, sign number 8. Well, we see that narcissists can cause imposter syndrome because they tend to criticize a lot and they tend to manipulate in terms of like gaslighting. So they try to make other people believe that they're the problem. So that's really consistent with this syndrome, of course. And some vulnerable narcissists seem to have imposter syndrome, right? Seems to be overrepresented among vulnerable narcissists. But somebody with psychopathy generally would not have this syndrome, and somebody with Machiavellianism would not. And of course, narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism are the dark triad traits. Those are the 3 traits in the dark triad. So with all this in mind, we see that this syndrome can make somebody feel like they have no control over their lives. They'll feel guilty about calling themselves a part of the profession that they belong to. Sometimes this syndrome is temporary. Sometimes it gets worse. Sometimes treatment may be warranted, although, again, it's not a mental disorder, but cognitive behavioral therapy could be helpful, like especially the component with logically evaluating appraisals, including self-appraisal. So looking at a self-appraisal and kind of being skeptical about it and really testing it, looking at the evidence and evaluating it. Those could be helpful skills to learn. Now, I also get this question around some professionals really being imposters. So not having the syndrome, but actually just being imposters. And, this is pretty straightforward. If the self-doubt is not rational, then that's probably more leaning toward imposter syndrome. And if it is rational, if the self-doubt makes sense, if somebody should doubt themselves, then they're just an imposter, right? Sometimes things aren't syndromes, they're just what they are. Sometimes it's not imposter syndrome. Sometimes somebody really is an imposter in a profession. Of course, we hope this doesn't happen too often, but this can happen too.
For more content like this, check out Healthy Toxic, another podcast from Ars Longa Media, all about what makes or breaks relationships, including issues related to narcissism, narcissistic abuse, and how personality disorders affect relationships. Ars Longa, Vita Brevis. Learn more at arslonga.media.